I was presenting a quarterly risk analysis to our executive board when my private emergency line vibrated. I stepped out to answer, expecting a routine alert. Instead, it was Thomas, my private wealth manager. He sounded completely breathless. He said, "Chloe, your $2.5 million penthouse was refinanced yesterday, and a $400,000 cash out is pending release right now." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I asked him how that was possible without my consent. He paused, and his next words chilled my blood. He said, "Your mother initiated the transfer." I grabbed my keys, abandoned the board meeting, and raced to the bank. When I finally saw the paperwork, I realized my family had not just betrayed me, they had committed federal fraud. My name is Chloe. I am 34 years old and I work as the Director of Risk Management at a major financial technology corporation in Chicago. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my family's web of lies and sent them spiraling into absolute ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to love you. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning. I was standing in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of our downtown headquarters. I had spent the last decade building my career from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks, sacrificing holidays, and dedicating every ounce of my energy to achieving financial independence. My expertise is literal risk management. My entire job revolves around identifying fraud, securing assets, and preventing financial disasters for multinational corporations. So you can imagine the absolute shock when the disaster struck my own personal portfolio. When my phone buzzed with Thomas calling, I knew something was critically wrong. Thomas manages the accounts for our firm's top executives. He does not call during business hours unless a major security breach has occurred. I excused myself, stepping into the quiet hallway, pressing the phone to my ear. Thomas did not even say hello. He just asked if I was in a secure location. I told him yes. That was when he dropped the bomb. "Chloe," he said, his voice unusually strained. "I received an automated alert on your primary real estate portfolio. The penthouse was refinanced yesterday afternoon. A cash-out wire transfer for $400,000 is sitting in the clearing queue right now." I stood frozen. The massive windows overlooking the Chicago skyline suddenly felt like they were closing in on me. I told him that was impossible. I bought that penthouse free and clear 3 years ago with my corporate bonuses. I have zero mortgage on that property. I have not signed a single piece of paper applying for a loan, let alone a cash-out refinance. Thomas took a sharp breath. "I know," he said. "That is why I manually halted the wire transfer and called you immediately. The paperwork was pushed through our rapid approval system late yesterday. It looks completely legitimate on the surface. But the beneficiary account for the $400,000 wire transfer does not match your primary accounts." "Who is the beneficiary?" I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The funds are directed to an external joint account," Thomas replied. "The primary account holder listed is Patricia, your mother." The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Patricia, my mother. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me that my obsession with finance was unnatural. The woman who constantly berated me for not choosing a soft, caring profession like nursing. The woman who always treated me like a cold, calculating disappointment while treating my younger sister Madison like a delicate princess who deserved the world on a silver platter. I did not ask any more questions. I told Thomas to lock down every single account associated with my social security number and to pull the physical files of the refinance application immediately. "I am on my way," I told him, and hung up. I walked back into the boardroom, grabbed my blazer, and looked directly at my CEO. "I have a critical security breach with my personal assets," I said. "I need to leave right now." My CEO, who knew I never panicked over minor issues, just nodded and told me to handle it. The drive to the bank was a blur of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced through the implications. Refinancing a luxury property is not a simple process. It requires extensive documentation credit checks, identity verification, and a formal closing process with a notary public. You cannot simply walk into a bank and take out a mortgage on a property you do not own. Yet my parents had somehow done exactly that. They had targeted my biggest, most valuable asset. The penthouse was my sanctuary. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into buying it. It represented my independence, my escape from their toxic, controlling household. And now they were trying to extract nearly $500,000 of my hard-earned equity. As I navigated through the heavy downtown traffic, the memories of their financial entitlement began to surface. Whenever my sister Madison wanted something, my parents expected me to foot the bill. When Madison wanted a lavish destination wedding, my father Richard demanded I pay for the catering because I was a high-earning executive. When I refused, they called me a selfish, greedy spinster. They always believed my money was family money, but their money was solely for Madison. But complaining about paying for dinner is one thing. Committing massive real estate fraud is an entirely different universe of betrayal. I pulled up to the bank headquarters, tossed my keys to the valet, and stormed through the heavy glass doors. The security guard recognized me and immediately swiped his badge to let me into the executive elevator. I rode up to the private wealth management floor, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was a federal crime. Thomas was waiting for me outside his office. He looked pale, holding a thick manila folder in his hands. He ushered me inside and locked the door behind us. We sat down at his desk, and he pushed the folder toward me. I pulled it up, Thomas said quietly. This is the entire closing package. The application, the title search, the identity verification, everything. It was submitted through a third-party mortgage broker and approved through our automated underwriting system because your credit score is flawless, and the property has zero debt. I opened the folder. Right there on top was the primary loan agreement. My name was printed at the top, but my eyes immediately dropped to the bottom of the page. There, sitting on the signature line, was my name signed in blue ink. It was a remarkably good forgery. It had the same aggressive slant I used, the same sharp loops on the letters. If I had not known with absolute certainty that I was sitting in a risk management seminar all day yesterday, I might have questioned my own sanity. This is not my signature, I said, my voice cold and hard. I was nowhere near a closing table yesterday. I want to know exactly how this bypassed identity verification. How does someone impersonate a bank client for a $500,000 transaction without raising red flags? Thomas flipped to the second page of the packet. He pointed to a specific section near the bottom. That is what I was trying to figure out, he said. You cannot do a remote closing in this state without a certified notary public physically verifying your government-issued ID and witnessing your signature. I looked at the spot he was pointing to. It was the notary acknowledgement block. The stamp was bold and black, certifying that Chloe herself had appeared in person, presented a valid identification, and signed the documents willingly. I read the name of the notary public printed inside the official stamp, and a wave of absolute disgust washed over me. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, revealing a betrayal so deep, so calculated that it took my breath away. The person who had notarized the forged documents was Jamal, my sister Madison's husband. I stared at the black ink of the notary stamp pressing into the crisp white paper. The name inside the official seal read Jamal Washington, my brother-in-law, Madison's husband. Jamal is a tall, impeccably groomed African-American man who always wore custom Italian suits he could barely afford. He worked as a senior loan officer at a competing mortgage firm across town. He always carried himself with an unwarranted arrogance at family dinners, bragging about his real estate connections and financial acumen. He loved to play the role of the big-shot provider for my sister. But I knew the truth. I knew he was stretched thin financially to maintain that facade. Now it was horrifyingly clear just how far he was willing to go to fund his lifestyle. He was leveraging his professional credentials to help my mother steal my home equity. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, running a heavy hand over his face. He said he could not believe this was happening. A licensed notary essentially handed them the keys to your property, Chloe. That is a direct violation of his state oath and a severe federal offense. I asked Thomas to pull up the identity verification scans from the digital file. I needed to see exactly how my mother passed herself off as me. Refinancing a home requires strict adherence to identity regulations. Thomas typed rapidly on his keyboard and turned his monitor toward me. He explained that every remote or third-party closing requires a high-resolution scan of the signer's government-issued identification. There, glaring back at me from the bright screen, was a driver license with my face on it. But it was not my current license. I leaned closer to the monitor, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. The issue date on that identification card was from 4 years ago. The address listed was my old condominium, not my current penthouse. I reached into my designer tote, pulled out my wallet, and slapped my actual valid driver license onto Thomas's desk. I told him to look at the expiration dates. Thomas compared the physical card to the scanned image on his screen. He let out a sharp breath. He said the one used for the closing expired 6 months ago. It is an invalid piece of identification. He asked how the underwriter did not catch this discrepancy. I told him exactly how they did not catch it. Because Jamal packaged the loan. As an industry insider, Jamal knew exactly how to game the system. He knew that automated underwriting software prioritizes the notary seal over a manual visual inspection of the identification expiration date on a third-party closing. If a licensed professional swears under penalty of perjury that he verified a valid ID, the automated system assumes compliance and pushes the paperwork through. Jamal intentionally buried the scan of the expired ID in the back of the digital file and slapped his official state seal on the front page. But the betrayal ran much deeper than Jamal's technical manipulation. I stared at the scanned image of that old ID, and a memory hit me with sickening clarity. 2 years ago, during a miserable Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house, my wallet had gone missing from my purse for an hour. My mother, Patricia, had suddenly found it slipped between the couch cushions in the den. She handed it back to me with a sweet, innocent smile. I had not noticed until 3 days later that my driver license was missing from the slot. I assumed it had fallen out at a coffee shop or a grocery store. I spent an entire Tuesday afternoon at the Department of Motor Vehicles getting a replacement. She stole it. I said the words out loud, my voice echoing in the quiet office. My own mother stole my identification card 2 years ago and kept it hidden. She planned this. She held on to my old ID, waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it against me. Thomas looked completely horrified. He asked if I was absolutely certain about this. I pointed aggressively at the computer screen. I told him Patricia is 59 years old. I am 34. We look absolutely nothing alike. Even with an expired ID, a legitimate notary would have taken one look at my mother and known instantly she was not the young woman in that photograph. Jamal did not just turn a blind eye to a clerical error. He actively conspired with Patricia. He allowed her to sit in a room, pretend to be me, forge my signature, and then he legally authenticated the forgery using his state-granted authority. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Patricia had always been emotionally and financially abusive. She treated me like a walking automatic teller machine, constantly demanding I pay for Madison's luxury vacations and designer bags. She believed that because she gave birth to me, she was entitled to a percentage of my net worth. But this was an entirely new dimension of depravity. They had orchestrated a sophisticated mortgage fraud scheme right under my nose. They weaponized Jamal's career to bypass the very security measures designed to protect assets like mine. I stood up and paced the length of the office. The rage inside me was no longer a hot, blinding flash. It was a cold, calculated, and razor-sharp focus. As a risk management director, I spent my days destroying corporate fraudsters who tried to exploit systemic loopholes. My family had just handed me a masterclass in identity theft. thinking I would be too weak or too tied to family loyalty to fight back. They thought I would quietly absorb a $400,000 debt just to protect Madison's husband from federal prison. They were dead wrong. Thomas asked what I wanted to do next. He said he needed to notify the fraud department immediately. We have to reverse the wire transfer, he explained, but once we flag this internally, it becomes a criminal matter. The bank will be legally obligated to report the notary to the state board, and federal law enforcement will absolutely get involved. He looked at me with genuine concern. He asked if I was prepared for the fallout of sending my own mother and brother-in-law to jail. I walked back to the desk and placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked Thomas dead in the eye. I told him I do not care if they share my blood. They crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Patricia used my stolen identity to steal my wealth. Jamal used his state commission to validate a felony. They did not care about my fallout when they decided to strip the equity from my home. I told him to initiate a hard stop on those funds immediately. Thomas did not hesitate. He knotted his fingers, flying across the keyboard, to lock the transaction permanently into the fraud review queue. The money was frozen. They were not getting a single dime of my money. But I was not finished. I told Thomas to print every single page of that forged closing packet. I wanted the fake signature. I wanted the scan of the stolen identification card. And most importantly, I wanted a high-quality printout of Jamal's notary stamp. I needed the physical evidence in my hands. Thomas sent the files to his secure printer, the machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of my family's criminal conspiracy. I gathered the warm papers and shoved them into my briefcase. The bank had stopped the financial bleeding, but the confrontation was just beginning. I stood in Thomas's office with the warm stack of forged documents in my hands. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of my family's absolute treachery. But I needed the complete picture. Stealing the equity was the mechanism, but I needed to know the ultimate destination of my money. I told Thomas to trace the routing number on the wire transfer. The initial document showed Patricia as the primary beneficiary, but criminals rarely keep stolen funds in a direct pass-through account. They move it quickly to avoid detection. I asked him to pull the wire instructions and find out exactly where that $400,000 was scheduled to land after it hit my mother's account. Thomas adjusted his glasses and leaned close to his monitor. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing standard client views and digging directly into the bank's back-end clearing system. The glow of the screen illuminated the deep lines of concern on his face. He pulled up the pending outgoing wire attached to the initial deposit. He swallowed hard and looked up at me. He said the funds were scheduled for an immediate secondary transfer, the exact second they cleared. The destination is a joint checking account. The account holders are Madison and Jamal Washington. A harsh, humorless laugh escaped my throat. Madison, my spoiled, entitled younger sister, the golden child who had never worked a full-time job in her life, who expected the world to bow at her feet simply because she existed. Of course, she was the ultimate beneficiary. My parents were willing to commit a federal felony just to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I demanded to know what the wire memo said. Nobody moves nearly $500,000 into a standard checking account without a specific documented purpose. Thomas clicked another button. He said the funds are explicitly marked for a direct escrow transfer to a title company. He read the property address listed on the memo line aloud. I instantly recognized the zip code. It was an ultra-exclusive gated community in the northern suburbs, a neighborhood filled with sprawling estates, infinity pools, and multi-million-dollar price tags. Madison had been obsessed with that neighborhood for years. She constantly posted pictures of those houses on her social media, complaining that Jamal's income as a loan officer was never enough to get them past the guarded gates. Now I understood the entire sickening scheme. Jamal and Madison wanted a mega mansion they could never afford on their own. Jamal, drowning in the pressure to look like a wealthy real estate mogul, realized he could not qualify for a legitimate jumbo loan. So he turned to his willing accomplices, my parents. Richard and Patricia probably saw this as their grand gesture to their favorite daughter. They decided to extract the cash from my paid-off penthouse use Jamal's notary credentials to bypass the legal safeguards and hand Madison the massive down payment she needed to buy her dream house. They literally cannibalized my financial security to buy Madison a mansion. I looked at the clock on Thomas's wall. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. The federal wire cutoff window was rapidly approaching. If that money officially left the bank's clearinghouse and hit the title company's escrow account, retrieving it would require months of agonizing, expensive litigation. I refused to let them hold my money hostage for even a second. I dropped my briefcase on the desk. I stopped acting like a betrayed daughter and completely shifted into my role as a director of risk management. I told Thomas to listen to me very carefully. I instructed him to completely bypass the standard fraud review queue. A standard administrative hold takes 48 hours to process, and the automated system might accidentally release the funds at the end of the business day if a manager forgets to sign off. I told him to initiate a federal fraud freeze directly through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network protocol. Thomas looked up, his eyes wide with shock. He reminded me that activating a federal fraud freeze is an aggressive, irreversible action. It triggers an automatic suspicious activity report to federal authorities. He said it would instantly red flag the routing numbers associated with Jamal, Madison, and Patricia across the entire national banking system. It locks the money in a digital dead zone that not even a bank vice president can override without a federal mandate. I slammed my hand on the desk. I told him I know exactly what it does. Do it right now. Thomas did not argue anymore. He recognized the tone in my voice. It was the exact tone I used when dismantling fraudulent corporate accounts at my own tech firm. He opened the high-security compliance portal. I watched over his shoulder as he entered his executive credentials. He selected the pending $400,000 transaction. He clicked the drop-down menu for Federal Compliance Intervention. He selected Suspected Identity Theft, Notary Fraud, and Unauthorized Asset Extraction. He hit Execute. A stark red banner flashed across his screen. The transaction status changed from pending to frozen federal hold. The digital guillotine had officially dropped. That $400,000 was not going to Madison's shiny new escrow account. It was not going to my mother's pass-through account. It was trapped in a digital vault, completely untouchable. Jamal and Madison were currently sitting in some real estate office, probably bragging to their agent about their massive down payment, completely unaware that their financial lifeline had just been severed by the federal government. Thomas exhaled a long breath and leaned back in his chair. He said, "It is done. The money is locked." He told me the bank's legal team would automatically file the paperwork with the authorities by the end of the day. I gathered the printed copies of the forged deed, the fake identification scans, and the fraudulent notary stamps. I stacked them neatly and placed them into my leather briefcase. The metallic snap of the briefcase lock echoed sharply in the quiet office. My family thought I was just a cold, work-obsessed woman who existed solely to be their financial backup plan. They thought they could execute a sloppy real estate heist and smile in my face at the next family dinner. They severely underestimated exactly what I do for a living. I thanked Thomas for his swift action. I turned and walked out of the private wealth management suite. My phone was buzzing in my pocket, a calendar reminder for a family barbecue my parents were hosting that very afternoon. It was supposed to be a celebration for Madison and Jamal, a celebration of their brand new, stolen house. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. I was not going back to my office. I was heading straight to the lion's den. The money was safe, but the war had officially begun. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the biting wind of the city. The valet brought my car around, and I tossed my heavy leather briefcase onto the passenger seat. Inside that bag was the physical proof of my family's absolute treachery. The forged application, the fake signature, the invalid identification scan, Jamal's fraudulent notary stamp. It was a complete dossier of criminal activity. It was everything I needed to send my own mother and my brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the keypad, ready to dial emergency services. It would be so easy to call the police right now. I could hand over the file, lodge a formal identity theft report, and let the authorities raid my parents' house during their little backyard barbecue. I could let the police slap cold metal handcuffs on Patricia and Jamal, while their wealthy neighbors watched from their manicured lawns. But I stopped myself. I locked my phone screen and tossed the device into the cup holder. Involving the authorities right away was too clean. It was too easy for them. If the police showed up without warning, Patricia would immediately play the victim. She would cry and claim she was confused. Madison would throw a hysterical fit and claim her stress was bad for the baby. Jamal would hide behind his slick suits and blame a clerical error in the banking system. They would spin a web of lies to protect their reputations. I could not allow that. I needed to look them straight in the eye first. I needed to be standing right in front of them when I delivered the blow. I wanted to watch the exact moment their house of cards collapsed. I wanted to see the smug entitlement melt off their faces when they realized their master plan had failed and they were not getting a single cent of my money. I merged my car onto the highway, heading toward the affluent suburbs where my parents lived. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt gave me time to process the magnitude of what they had attempted. I glanced at the briefcase resting on the passenger seat. That file represented my penthouse. It represented my sanctuary. Buying that property was not a stroke of luck or a handout. It was the culmination of a decade of absolute sacrifice. While Madison was taking expensive gap years to find herself and racking up massive credit card debt on designer clothes, I was chained to my corporate desk. I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks in the high-pressure risk management sector. I ate dinner from office vending machines at midnight. I slept on uncomfortable leather couches during week-long corporate audits. I missed weddings, skipped birthdays, and abandoned vacations because I was relentlessly determined to build an impenetrable financial fortress for myself. When I finally received my massive executive bonus 3 years ago, I did not buy sports cars or book luxury trips to Europe. I bought my $2.5 million penthouse in cash, free and clear. It was my physical proof that my grueling sacrifices actually meant something. And how did my family react to my success? They absolutely despised me for it. They constantly called me cold, dry, and unfeeling. During family dinners, my father Richard would sneer at my tailored business suits and tell me that a woman my age should be focusing on building a warm family, not a cold bank account. My mother Patricia would dramatically sigh and tell her social club friends that I was a workaholic robot who lacked basic human empathy. They painted me as this soulless corporate machine simply because I refused to finance their extravagant lifestyles. They worshipped Madison because she was soft, needy, and traditional. She married Jamal, got pregnant, and played the role of the perfect, helpless daughter who always needed saving. Yet the sheer hypocrisy of it all was sickening. They hated my ambition, but they felt entirely entitled to the wealth it generated. They called me greedy for protecting my assets, but they were perfectly willing to commit federal identity theft to steal those exact same assets. They looked at my penthouse, a home built on my exhaustion and sweat, and saw nothing but a massive piggy bank to fund Madison's suburban mega mansion dream. They thought my years of hard work existed solely to subsidize their fake luxury lifestyle. I took the exit for their neighborhood. The streets grew wider, lined with perfectly manicured lawns and massive oak trees. I turned onto their street and saw the expensive cars parked along the curb. Jamal's leased luxury sport utility vehicle was parked prominently right in the middle of the driveway. The sounds of upbeat music and loud, obnoxious laughter drifted over the tall wooden fence. They were throwing a barbecue. A celebration for Madison and Jamal. A party to toast the new house they genuinely thought they had just bought with my stolen money. I parked my car directly behind Jamal's vehicle, intentionally blocking him in. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence of the cabin for a moment. I closed my eyes and took one deep, steadying breath. I was about to walk into a lion's den of manipulation and gaslighting. I knew exactly how they operated. They would try to make me feel crazy. They would try to justify their massive crimes as a simple family favor. They would try to make me the ultimate villain for not blindly giving up $500,000 to my pregnant sister. I opened my eyes. The hurt, rejected daughter inside me was completely dead. The woman stepping out of this car was the director of risk management, and I was about to liquidate their entire fraudulent enterprise. I grabbed my briefcase, slammed the car door shut, and marched toward the backyard gate. The storm they created had officially arrived. I pushed the heavy wooden gate open with enough force that it banged loudly against the brick wall. The lively sound of upbeat summer music and clinking glasses immediately washed over me. The smell of expensive grilled steaks and charred hickory filled the air. My father Richard was standing by the massive outdoor grill flipping meat with a customized silver spatula. My mother Patricia was pouring imported champagne into crystal flutes. And there, sitting in the center of the patio furniture like absolute royalty, were Madison and Jamal. Madison was wearing a flowing designer maternity dress, resting her hand performatively on her slightly rounded belly. Jamal was leaning back in his luxury lounge chair, a smug grin plastered across his face, holding a craft beer. They were literally raising their glasses in a toast. "To our beautiful daughter and our brilliant son-in-law," Richard announced loudly, holding his spatula in the air. "Congratulations on closing on the new estate. That neighborhood is going to be incredibly lucky to have you. Here is to generational wealth and family success." I marched directly across the manicured lawn. The heels of my shoes sank slightly into the soft grass, but my posture was completely rigid. The casual chatter died down as soon as they noticed me approaching. My father lowered his spatula, his brow furrowing. Madison stopped mid-sip, her eyes darting to the heavy leather briefcase in my hand. Jamal stiffened in his seat. His arrogant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place, attempting to look unbothered. I did not say a single word of greeting. I walked straight to the glass patio table right in the middle of their lavish spread of artisanal cheeses and expensive crackers. I unlatched my briefcase. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly over the fading backyard music. I pulled out the thick stack of printed bank documents, the forged application, the fake signature, the illegal notary stamp. I slammed the entire stack down onto the glass table with a violent thud. The impact made the crystal champagne flutes rattle dangerously. I looked directly at my mother. I told her I just came from the bank. I told her I saw the refinance documents for my penthouse. I expected panic. I expected her to turn pale, to stammer, to try and deny her involvement. I expected at least an ounce of shame for getting caught committing identity theft. Instead, Patricia simply rolled her eyes. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, carefully smoothed her perfectly styled hair, and let out a scoff that dripped with absolute condescension. She looked at me not like a criminal who had been caught, but like a mother annoyed by a misbehaving toddler. "Why are you overreacting like this?" Patricia said, her voice completely devoid of any guilt. "You are making a massive scene over absolutely nothing. What do you even need a huge penthouse all to yourself for anyway? You live alone, you work all day, it is just empty space. Madison is about to give birth to my grandchild. Jamal needs a big home office for his real estate business. You are a corporate director making $500,000 a year. Giving your sister a $400,000 boost will not kill you." I stood there staring at the woman who gave birth to me, utterly paralyzed by her sheer audacity. She was not denying the crime. She was annoyed that I dared to be upset about it. She genuinely believed that stealing $500,000 of my equity was simply a justified reallocation of family resources. Madison adjusted herself in her chair and sighed loudly, playing the victim, exactly on cue. She said, "Chloe, honestly, you are being so selfish right now. Jamal and I have been stressed sick about finding the right house for the baby. You have all that money tied up in a property you barely even use. We are actually putting it to good use to build a family. You should be happy to help us out. That is what supportive sisters do." Jamal nodded in agreement, taking a casual sip of his beer, as if we were discussing a minor grocery bill. He said, "Look, Chloe, the rates I locked in for you were extremely competitive. You should be thanking me. Most people would pay a premium for the kind of rapid closing I orchestrated. I handled all the tedious paperwork, so you would not have to interrupt your busy schedule. We kept it entirely in the family nice and quiet." My blood boiled in my veins. I looked at the three of them. A mother who committed identity theft. A sister who felt entirely entitled to my life savings. A brother-in-law who abused his federal license to facilitate a massive heist. They were sitting in a sunlit backyard eating expensive steaks, genuinely believing they had outsmarted me. They thought my financial success was a communal pot of gold they could dip their greedy hands into whenever they felt inadequate. Richard stepped forward, pointing his spatula at me defensively. "Your mother is right, Chloe," he grumbled. "We raised you. We paid for your braces, your food, your clothes growing up. You owe this family. We did not even take the full value of your penthouse. We left you plenty of equity to live on. So put those ridiculous papers away, grab a plate, and celebrate your sister's new home like a normal person." The absolute delusion radiating from them was staggering. They had convinced themselves that forging my signature and robbing my bank account was a noble family act. They expected me to simply swallow a massive fraudulent mortgage just to keep the peace and fund Madison's luxurious suburban fantasy. They expected me to surrender. I did not grab a plate. I did not take a single step toward their lavish spread of food. I stood completely still, my eyes locked onto my father. I let his ridiculous demand hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocating. The upbeat music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly felt entirely out of place. I told them there would be no celebration today, tomorrow, or ever. I told them the money was not coming. Madison frowned, her hand dropping defensively from her stomach. She asked what I was talking about. She looked at her husband and said Jamal already initiated the wire transfer. She said the title company was expecting the escrow deposit by the end of the business day. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. I told him he should know better as a senior loan officer. I told him I did not just call customer service to complain about a suspicious charge. I went directly to the branch manager of Private Wealth. I told him I initiated a federal fraud freeze. I made sure to enunciate the word federal so it echoed across the patio. The color instantly drained from Jamal's face. The cocky, arrogant posture he had been maintaining vanished in a fraction of a second. His jaw slackened. As a mortgage industry professional, he knew exactly what that term meant. He knew the money was currently locked in a digital dead zone. He knew it was entirely out of reach, completely untouchable, and firmly under the microscope of federal banking authorities. No escrow, no mansion, just a massive glaring red flag on his professional license. My father realized the implications of what I had just said. He realized that the massive down payment for his golden child was gone. His face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. He dropped his silver spatula. He slammed his heavy fist down on the glass patio table with a violent, explosive force. The impact rattled the plates, bounced the silverware, and sent a crystal champagne flute tipping over. The expensive liquid spilled across the glass surface, dripping down onto the concrete below. "You cold-blooded, ungrateful wretch," Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He stepped away from the grill, marching toward me with his chest puffed out, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You have always been exactly like this," he screamed, his voice booming over the quiet hum of the affluent neighborhood. "Cold, selfish, and completely dead inside. You care more about your bloated bank accounts than your own flesh and blood." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at him with absolute indifference. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face. He told me I owed them this money. He shouted that I had owed this family ever since the day I turned 18. He screamed that he had explicitly forbidden me from studying finance. He reminded me of his grand plan for my life, the plan where my only purpose was to serve them. He yelled that he ordered me to stay right here in this house to study nursing, to be the built-in caretaker for him and Patricia as they aged, and to be a permanent support system for Madison. But you defied me. He bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging. You packed your bags in the middle of the night. You walked out that front door, and you turned your back on this family to chase corporate greed in the city. You abandoned your duties. He took another step closer, his breath reeking of anger and alcohol. And now that you have clawed your way to the top, you think you can just come back here and trample all over your sister. You think your money makes you untouchable. I am your father. I brought you into this world. I put a roof over your head. I have every single right to use your assets to compensate Madison for the stable family environment you destroyed when you walked out on us. The absolute insanity of his logic washed over me. He honestly believed my wealth was a family tax. He genuinely believed that because I refused to be their domestic servant 16 years ago, my current assets were theirs to freely distribute. They wanted to punish me for achieving the exact independence and success they had explicitly tried to prevent. In his twisted mind, committing identity theft and federal mortgage fraud was simply a father collecting a long overdue debt from a disobedient child. I looked past his red, screaming face. I looked at Patricia, who was nodding along with his deranged, toxic speech, her arms crossed in righteous agreement. I looked at Madison, who was crying real dramatic tears, now clutching her husband's arm as she realized her mega mansion dream was slipping through her fingers. The air around us was thick with the smell of charred meat and spilled champagne. I stood my ground, my high heels planted firmly on their stone patio. I let him scream. I let him vent every ounce of his toxic entitlement and deep-seated resentment. Hearing him say those words out loud only confirmed every single reason I had for packing those bags and escaping this house when I was a teenager. He thought yelling would break me. He thought the booming, authoritative voice of the family patriarch would force me into submission just like it did when I was a terrified, helpless child. He expected me to cower, apologize, and surrender my hard-earned wealth to appease his ego. But I was not an 18-year-old girl anymore. I was a corporate executive who handled hostile negotiations and dismantled multi-million-dollar risk threats for a living. His anger was nothing but useless, desperate noise. I let his echo fade into the open air of the backyard. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, unhinged energy. I simply stared at him until his heavy breathing slowed. I was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to treat a risk management director like a subservient piggy bank. Before my father could draw enough breath to launch into another unhinged tirade, Jamal stepped directly between us. The heavy, oppressive silence of the patio was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. Jamal knew that screaming and intimidation would never work on me. He realized his father-in-law had just made the situation infinitely worse. Jamal reached out and grabbed my elbow. I immediately yanked my arm away with enough force to make him stumble forward. I shot him a look so lethal, he instinctively raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. He lowered his voice, his eyes darting nervously toward the low brick fence separating my parents' yard from the neighbors. He asked me to step to the side of the house for just 1 minute. He pleaded with his hands, begging for a private conversation, away from the glaring eyes of my parents and his sobbing wife. I followed him toward the narrow, shaded walkway near the pool equipment purely out of a dark, morbid curiosity to hear exactly how he planned to dig himself out of a federal crater. The moment we were out of direct eyesight, Jamal leaned his tall frame against the cool brick wall. The charismatic, flashy real estate hotshot was completely gone. His custom-tailored suit, which he usually wore like armor, suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. Heavy beads of sweat gathered on his forehead and upper lip. He dropped the arrogant, superior attitude entirely. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered criminal staring down the barrel of a ruined life. "Look at me, sister-in-law," Jamal started, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper. "We need to talk like adults. I am the one who approved this loan. I personally packaged the file. I am the one who stamped the notary seal. My signature and my license number are permanently attached to those documents you are holding in that briefcase. He took a step closer, his dark eyes wide with an intense, suffocating panic. If you do not call the bank and cancel that fraud alert right now, my life is entirely over. If you go to the police and hand over those papers, I lose my state license permanently. My career in finance is dead. He swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He decided to play his final card, aiming straight for a sense of familial guilt he mistakenly thought I possessed. Think about Madison. He pleaded, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. Think about your sister. If I go down for this, we lose everything. Madison ends up out on the street with absolutely nothing. Your niece or nephew is going to be born fatherless because I will be locked in a cell. Are you really going to stand there and send your own brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary? Are you going to destroy your sister's family over a simple financial dispute? I watched him perform. It was a pathetic display of emotional manipulation. He was trying to shift the blame, making me the villain for refusing to be the victim. Lift the freeze, he begged, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Just make a phone call. Tell the bank manager it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them you gave us verbal permission and the paperwork just got messy. I swear to you on my life, Chloe, I will pay you back every single cent. We can write up a private contract right now. I will set up an automatic transfer from my accounts to yours. I will pay you back with premium interest in monthly installments. You will not lose a single dollar. Just do not destroy my family. I stared at his desperate, sweating face. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of pure, unfiltered contempt. The sound of it echoed off the brick walls, sharp and cutting. A private contract. I repeated, my voice dripping with absolute mockery. You want me to lift a federal fraud freeze so you can buy a multi-million-dollar mansion, and in return, you are offering me an unsecured promise to pay me back. You want me to authorize a $400,000 handshake loan to a man who literally just committed identity theft to rob me? Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped forward, forcing him to press his back flat against the brick wall. I am a director of risk management, Jamal, I said, keeping my tone deadly quiet and perfectly measured. I assess financial liabilities for a living. I destroy corporate fraudsters for breakfast. And you are the very definition of a catastrophic risk. I looked him up and down, mentally dismantling his entire fake empire. I know exactly who you are, I continued. You cannot even afford the lease on that luxury sport utility vehicle sitting in the driveway. You buy expensive suits and expensive drinks to look like a wealthy mogul, but your debt-to-income ratio must be a complete nightmare. You cannot afford to buy a house in that gated community without stealing your sister-in-law's equity. You do not have the capital to pay me back a fraction of that money. And even if you did, your word is absolutely worthless. But I can get the money. Jamal stammered, his eyes darting around wildly. I have commissions coming in. I have deals closing. I cut him off. Do you honestly think I am stupid enough to believe a liar who hides behind a notary stamp? I asked. You and my mother conspired to bypass security protocols designed to stop criminals exactly like you. You thought because I am family, I would be a soft target. You thought I would just cry, forgive you, and absorb a massive mortgage to keep Madison happy. Jamal shook his head desperately. Chloe, please, you cannot do this to the baby. You should have thought about your unborn child before you stamped a forged document, I whispered, stepping back and adjusting the strap of my briefcase. You should have thought about your career before you decided to play a high-stakes game of fraud with a woman who analyzes fraud for a living. I am not lifting the freeze. I am not covering up your crimes to save your pathetic ego. I turned on my heel and began walking back toward the patio. I stopped and looked over my shoulder one last time. You better find yourself a very good criminal defense attorney, Jamal, I said coldly. And you better start saving your pennies to pay his retainer. Wait for the subpoena. I emerged from the shadowed walkway and stepped back into the bright sunlight of the patio. Jamal trailed a few paces behind me, his shoulders slumped, his face an ash-gray mask of absolute defeat. The cocky stride of the successful loan officer was completely gone. The moment Madison took one look at her husband's shattered posture, she knew his little private negotiation had failed. She knew the money was still locked away in a federal void. She knew her multi-million-dollar mega mansion was slipping through her fingers forever. That is when the true theatrical performance began. Madison let out a shrill, piercing wail that shattered whatever quiet remained in the affluent backyard. She collapsed heavily back into her luxury lounge chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent, exaggerated sobs. She cried out that I was ruining her entire life. She shrieked that the stress I was causing was going to harm the baby. She wailed that I was a jealous, bitter, evil woman who simply could not stand to see her younger sister happy. She painted a picture of absolute victimhood. She acted as though I had walked into her home and physically assaulted her, rather than simply protecting my own stolen bank accounts from a highly coordinated fraud ring. Right on cue, the enablers swooped in. Richard dropped his barbecue tongs and rushed to Madison's side, patting her shoulder and glaring at me as if I were a literal monster. Patricia hovered over her golden child, cooing soft, coddling words of comfort, treating a 30-year-old married woman like a helpless toddler who had just dropped her ice cream cone. They created a physical barricade around her, shielding her from the big, bad corporate sister who stubbornly refused to be robbed blind. My father practically growled at me, pointing a thick finger and telling me to look at what my extreme selfishness was doing to a vulnerable pregnant woman. He actually tried to weaponize her pregnancy against me. He blamed my strict financial boundaries for her emotional breakdown, completely ignoring the fact that her husband and mother had committed a major felony to buy her a house. I stood there with my heavy leather briefcase in hand, watching this pathetic display of toxic codependency. It was absolutely sickening. They were completely ignoring the massive legal crisis looming over their heads. To them, federal identity theft was a minor technicality. The only real tragedy here was that Madison was not getting her way. Patricia slowly stood up from Madison's side. The comforting, doting mother vanished in an instant. Her face hardened into a mask of pure vicious malice. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and took a slow, deliberate step toward me. She did not yell. She did not scream. Instead, she used a cold, venomous tone designed to cut straight to the bone. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered her ultimatum. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to fix this mess. She commanded me to pick up my phone call, my private wealth manager, and authorize the full release of those funds by noon tomorrow. She said if I did not comply, she would make it her absolute personal mission to destroy my entire life. Patricia leaned in closer, a nasty, calculated smirk playing on her lips. She threatened to call every single person in our extended family and tell them I was a greedy, unhinged daughter who was trying to put her pregnant sister out on the street. But she did not stop at family gossip. She knew my career was my lifeblood. She threatened to take her malicious smear campaign straight to my corporate headquarters. She said she would email my executive board. She said she would call my colleagues and tell them that I was mentally unstable. She would claim that I was actively harassing my family, stealing from them, and that I was completely unfit to manage millions of dollars in corporate risk when I was aggressively destroying my own flesh and blood. She promised to drag my professional name through the mud until I was a total pariah in the financial sector. She was holding my hard-earned reputation hostage. She was betting everything on the assumption that my fear of public humiliation would override my desire to protect my assets. She thought the threat of a ruined career would force me to surrender my penthouse equity. As a risk management professional, I evaluate threats for a living. I look at leverage exposure and potential fallout. I looked at the woman who was supposed to be my mother. I looked at the father who was comforting a whining thief. I looked at the sister who felt utterly entitled to my life savings, and I felt absolutely nothing for any of them. The last lingering shred of familial obligation completely evaporated right there on that stone patio, leaving behind a profound, unshakable clarity. Their leverage was entirely imaginary. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not try to defend my character, or beg for their understanding. I looked directly into Patricia's vindictive, desperate eyes. I told her she could call whoever she wanted. I told her she could stand on the highest rooftop in Chicago and scream her pathetic lies to the entire city. I said it would not change a single detail of what was coming for them. I told her I do not negotiate with emotional terrorists, and I absolutely do not fund the lifestyles of entitled criminals. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back when Madison's dramatic wails grew even louder, or when my father shouted my name in a fit of impotent rage. I walked straight across the manicured lawn, the sound of my heels striking the concrete driveway echoing with absolute finality. I unlocked my car, tossed my briefcase onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I backed out of their driveway, leaving them to drown in the chaotic, terrifying mess of their own making. I did not yield a single inch. The 24-hour countdown had officially begun, but they had absolutely no idea who held the real power. I walked into the sleek glass lobby of our corporate headquarters at exactly 7 in the morning. I was running on zero sleep and black coffee, but my tailored business suit was flawless, and my posture was completely rigid. I expected a standard Wednesday morning of evaluating compliance reports. Instead, my executive assistant intercepted me before I even reached my office door. She looked incredibly nervous. She told me the chief executive officer and the head of human resources were waiting for me in the top floor boardroom. They requested my immediate presence. I took the private elevator up. I mentally prepared for any sudden corporate crisis, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of my own parents. I walked into the sprawling boardroom. The CEO, a man who had mentored me for years and respected my ruthless efficiency, sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. The HR director sat next to him, looking deeply uncomfortable and clutching a printed piece of paper. The CEO gestured to the empty leather seat across from them. He slid the printed email across the polished wood toward me. I picked it up. The sender address belonged to Patricia. She had somehow managed to scrape the contact information for our entire executive board and senior partners. I read the text, and my blood turned to absolute ice. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation, disguised as maternal concern. Patricia wrote that she was reaching out with a heavy broken heart regarding her beloved daughter Chloe. She claimed I was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed mental health crisis. She explicitly lied and said I was currently experiencing a psychotic break manifesting in paranoid delusions and erratic financial hoarding. The email went on to accuse me of embezzling family funds to fuel a secret gambling addiction. Richard had clearly added his own aggressive input, inserting a paragraph claiming I was violently threatening my pregnant sister and was entirely unfit to manage corporate risk. They ended their malicious manifesto by begging the board to compassionately terminate my employment, so I would be forced to hit rock bottom and seek the psychiatric help I desperately needed. They thought they could strip me of my high salary, my stellar reputation, and my corporate health care in one coordinated strike. They honestly thought losing my job would break my spirit and force me to release the federal freeze on their stolen money out of pure desperation. I finished reading the email. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I looked up at the CEO and the HR director with a completely stoic expression. The HR director nervously cleared her throat and asked if there was any truth to these incredibly serious allegations. She mentioned that corporate policy required them to investigate any claims of mental instability in the risk management department. I did not answer with defensive words. I simply placed my heavy leather briefcase on the conference table. It was the exact same briefcase I had carried to my parents' backyard yesterday. I unlatched the metal locks and pulled out the thick stack of bank documents. I laid out the forged mortgage application, the scan of my stolen and expired identification card, and the fake notary stamp bearing Jamal's name. I pushed the evidence toward the center of the table. I looked directly at my CEO and told him this is not a mental health crisis. I told him this is a retaliatory smear campaign from a family of desperate felons. I explained exactly how my mother and my brother-in-law had conspired to commit federal identity theft to extract $400,000 from my paid-off penthouse. I told them I had initiated a federal fraud freeze yesterday afternoon, and this deranged email was their vindictive response to getting caught. The CEO picked up the forged documents. He is a man who built his corporate empire by ruthlessly eliminating liabilities and destroying fraudsters. He carefully compared the fake signature on the loan application to the hundreds of internal documents I had signed for his company over the years. He looked at the blatantly expired identification scan. A slow, dark chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. He tossed the papers back onto the table. He looked at the HR director and told her to completely disregard the email and destroy all copies. Then he pressed the intercom button on his communication console. He requested Valerie to come to the boardroom immediately. Valerie is the general counsel for our entire corporation. She is a notoriously aggressive, brilliant corporate attorney who eats hostile litigators for breakfast and destroys rival companies for fun. 5 minutes later, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Valerie walked in, her sharp designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She was a literal force of nature, completely unbothered by pleasantries. The CEO pointed to the documents on the table and told her that someone outside the company was attempting to extort and defame his best director of risk management. Valerie picked up the file. Her sharp eyes darted across the forged notary stamp and the illegal transaction records. A dangerous, predatory smile spread slowly across her face. She looked at me with genuine professional respect. She said this is textbook federal wire fraud and a catastrophic misuse of a state notary commission. She asked me what my current legal representation looked like. I told her I had not hired a private attorney yet because the criminal discovery was only 24 hours old. Valerie dropped the file onto the table. She said my parents made a fatal miscalculation today. By sending a highly defamatory email to the entire executive board of a major financial technology corporation, they had actively attempted to disrupt corporate operations, damage the company's standing, and intentionally inflict financial harm on a key executive. She looked at the CEO, who nodded in absolute silent agreement. Valerie leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the mahogany table. She looked me dead in the eye. She told me that I no longer needed to waste my time looking for a private attorney. She said the full weight of the corporate legal department was now completely at my disposal, entirely free of charge. She offered to personally rip my family to shreds, in both civil and federal court. My parents had tried to permanently destroy my career this morning, but all they managed to do was hand me a multi-million-dollar legal arsenal on a silver platter. I walked out of the boardroom feeling an unfamiliar sense of absolute invincibility. For my entire life, my parents had held all the power. They used guilt, shame, and fear to keep me in line. They honestly believed their defamatory email would have me crying in the human resources office, begging for my job and handing over my penthouse equity just to make the nightmare stop. Instead, they had inadvertently handed me the ultimate corporate shield. Valerie, our ruthless general counsel, had already drafted a cease and desist order so legally devastating that it would make a seasoned litigator sweat. My career was completely bulletproof. I returned to my office, sat down in my ergonomic chair, and took a deep breath. I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that their corporate sabotage had failed miserably. But my peace only lasted for exactly 2 hours. My phone vibrated violently on my desk. The screen lit up with a barrage of incoming text messages. They were from Madison. She had clearly realized that the corporate hit job orchestrated by our parents had not resulted in my immediate termination. Since she could not destroy my career to get her money, she pivoted instantly to the next weapon in her toxic arsenal. She resorted to extreme emotional blackmail. I picked up the phone and opened the text thread. Madison had typed a massive block of frantic, manipulative text. She wrote that I was a cold, heartless monster. She said I thought I was so smart playing games with the bank, but I was actually destroying our family. Then she dropped the emotional hammer. Madison wrote that if I did not call Thomas and unfreeze the $400,000 right now, Mom and Dad were going to lose absolutely everything. She claimed they were drowning in insurmountable debt, and the bank was threatening imminent foreclosure. She said they were completely broke and desperate. Then she twisted the knife. She brought up the backyard garden. When I was 10 years old, my late grandmother moved in with us for her final years. She was the only person in that house who ever showed me genuine, unconditional love. While my parents fawned over Madison, my grandmother would take me into the backyard. Together we planted a beautiful sprawling garden of blue hydrangeas and climbing roses. It was my sanctuary. Madison knew exactly how much that patch of earth meant to me. Madison typed that because I was hoarding my wealth, Mom and Dad were being forced to sell the childhood house to a commercial developer to cover their massive debts. She said the developer was going to bulldoze the entire property by the end of the month. She wrote that the tractor was going to rip up Grandma's garden and pour concrete over the roses. She ended the text by asking if I really wanted to see my own parents homeless and sleeping on the street at their age, all because I was too greedy to share what I had. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. A younger, more fragile version of myself might have broken down right then and there. The thought of a bulldozer tearing through the roses I had planted with my grandmother made my chest physically ache. Madison was banking heavily on that pain. She wanted me blinded by grief, nostalgia, and daughterly guilt. She wanted me to panic and release the funds to save the family home. But the emotional reaction only lasted for a few seconds. The panic faded, and the analytical mind of a risk management director stepped in. I read the text message a second time, completely detaching myself from the emotional manipulation and focusing purely on the data points. Something was fundamentally wrong with Madison's entire narrative. The math simply did not add up. My parents bought that 4-bedroom suburban house over 30 years ago. Richard had a solid career as a mid-level executive before retiring, and Patricia always managed their finances with an iron fist. They paid off their primary mortgage a decade ago. They did not take extravagant international vacations. They did not buy yachts or collect vintage sports cars. They lived comfortably, but well within their means. How could they suddenly be facing imminent bankruptcy? How could they be drowning in so much debt that they were willing to sell their fully paid-off home to a commercial developer? Furthermore, I realized the glaring contradiction in their story. Just a few hours ago at the barbecue, the narrative was that the $400,000 was a down payment for Madison and Jamal's luxurious new mega mansion. Jamal had specifically told me he needed the money for escrow, but now Madison was claiming the money was desperately needed to save Mom and Dad from living on the street. Which one was it? Were they buying a suburban palace, or were they fighting off foreclosure? Criminals always trip up when their lies become too complex to manage. The conflicting stories exposed a massive hidden truth. They were not just trying to buy a house to elevate Jamal's fragile ego. They were trying to plug a massive hemorrhaging financial hole. But whose hole was it? I placed my phone face down on the desk. I did not reply to Madison. I was not going to play her twisted game of emotional extortion. Instead, I opened a secure encrypted browser on my work computer. It was time to stop treating this like a messy family dispute and start treating it like a high-stakes corporate fraud investigation. I needed to follow the money. As a risk executive, I have access to comprehensive public record databases and advanced financial background check software used for corporate vetting. I typed my parents' names into the search portal. If they were truly facing foreclosure and bankruptcy, there would be public legal filings, liens, and court dockets attached to their property. I needed to see the exact numbers. I needed to find out what kind of catastrophic financial black hole my charismatic Italian suit-wearing brother-in-law had dragged my parents into. The truth was hiding in the data, and I was about to drag it out into the light. I opened the secured risk assessment portal on my dual monitors. As an executive in financial technology, my clearance level grants me access to deep-tier background check software and comprehensive public record databases that ordinary citizens do not even know exist. I bypassed the standard consumer credit bureaus and tapped directly into the commercial risk evaluation network. I entered my father and mother into the search parameters. I needed to see the exact structural integrity of their financial lives. The system processed the request, aggregating decades of property records, tax filings, credit histories, and civil court dockets. The progress bar hit 100%, and a massive data file populated on my screen. I scrolled past their decades of pristine payment history. For most of my life, Richard and Patricia were incredibly prudent with their finances. They paid off the childhood home 15 years ago. They had solid retirement accounts. They were the kind of people who judged others for carrying credit card balances. But as I scrolled down to the activity from the last 2 years, the pristine record abruptly ended. It was replaced by a chaotic, bleeding mess of high-risk financial maneuvers. Exactly 24 months ago, my parents had taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the fully paid-off suburban house. They did not just borrow a small sum for renovations. They extracted maximum value, pulling out hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they did it using a secondary high-interest lender known for predatory rates. It was a desperation move. It was the kind of loan people take out when traditional banks refuse to lend to them and they need liquid cash immediately to stave off a disaster. I cross-referenced the property records with the county clerk database. Madison was actually telling the truth about one single thing. My parents were completely broke. The system showed 3 consecutive missed payments on that massive loan. A notice of default had been filed locally just 30 days ago. The bank was legally preparing to foreclose on the house and seize the property. My parents were literally standing on the edge of total financial ruin. But the real question remained unanswered. Where did all that money go? My parents did not buy a vacation home. They did not have catastrophic medical bills. They did not suddenly develop a taste for luxury sports cars. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had vanished into thin air over the span of a single week 2 years ago. I opened a new search tab. I typed in the name Jamal Washington. If my parents were sinking, the anchor tied to their feet had to be my flashy Italian suit-wearing brother-in-law. I initiated a deep financial scan on Jamal. The system churned for a moment before vomiting a horrifying sequence of public records, tax liens, and civil judgments onto my screen. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes darting across the dates and the dollar amounts. The story hiding in the data was so disgusting it made my stomach physically turn. 2 years ago, right around the exact same time my parents took out that desperate loan on their house, the cryptocurrency market experienced a massive historic crash. Millions of amateur investors lost their life savings overnight. According to the civil court filings, Jamal was not just an amateur investor. He was a reckless, arrogant gambler. He had taken out massive leveraged positions on unregulated offshore crypto exchanges. He had borrowed heavily on margin betting money he did not actually have on digital coins that promised guaranteed wealth. When the crypto market collapsed, Jamal got margin called. The exchanges demanded immediate repayment of the leveraged funds. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in the hole, facing immediate bankruptcy and potential legal action from his creditors. He was drowning. The timeline aligned with terrifying precision. Jamal lost a fortune in imaginary digital currency. He panicked. He knew he could not qualify for a legitimate loan to cover his massive losses because his debt-to-income ratio was already a disaster. So he went to his adoring gullible in-laws. He went to Richard and Patricia. I could picture the exact scenario in my head. Jamal crying in their living room, playing the victim, claiming the market was rigged against him. He probably convinced them that if he filed for bankruptcy, he would lose his mortgage license. He would lose his job. Madison would be married to a disgraced unemployed failure. He manipulated their obsessive need to maintain a perfect family image. He preyed on their unconditional worship of Madison. And my parents, the people who refused to pay for my college housing because they claimed it would build my character, willingly mortgaged their entire life savings to bail out a degenerate gambler. They signed away the house I grew up in, the house with my grandmother's beautiful garden, just to save Jamal from facing the consequences of his own monumental stupidity. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, entirely breathless. The sheer magnitude of the parasitic relationship was staggering. Jamal was a financial vampire. He had attached himself to my family and bled my parents completely dry. He sucked every ounce of equity out of their lifelong investment to cover his catastrophic crypto failure. And instead of cutting him off, instead of forcing him to take responsibility, my parents absorbed his debt. They let him continue wearing expensive suits and leasing luxury vehicles, while they quietly suffocated under the crushing weight of the predatory loan they took out to save him. But the parasite was not finished. Now that my parents were completely tapped out, now that the bank was coming to repossess their home and throw them out onto the street, Jamal needed a new host. He needed a new source of blood. He could not let the facade crumble. He needed to keep up the appearance of the wealthy real estate mogul. Madison needed to keep playing the wealthy suburban housewife. And my parents, utterly terrified of the social humiliation of losing their home, were too deep in his web to stop him. So Jamal pointed them toward the only remaining asset in the family, my $2.5 million penthouse. He convinced them that stealing from me was the only way out. He orchestrated the identity theft, packaged the fraudulent refinance, and used his notary stamp to seal the deal. He convinced them to risk federal prison just to extract $400,000 from my property. Madison claimed the money was to save the parents from homelessness, while Jamal claimed it was to buy a mega mansion. In reality, it was a desperate cash grab to keep the entire fraudulent bankrupt circus afloat for a few more months. They were not a family. They were a criminal syndicate organized around a shared delusion. They thought I was just an oblivious corporate drone with deep pockets. They thought they could silently siphon my wealth and continue living their fake glamorous lives while I paid the mortgage on their delusions. I reached forward and closed the secure browser. The data was saved. The timeline was established. The motive was irrefutably documented. Jamal had ruined my parents, and my parents had willingly offered me up as the next sacrifice. I felt a cold, dark smile spread across my face. They wanted to play high-stakes financial games. They wanted to steal from a woman who destroys financial predators for a living. I was not just going to stop their fraudulent loan. I was going to tear down their entire fake empire and let the federal government sort through the ashes. I stared at the glowing monitor of my office computer, my mind racing as the true magnitude of the situation began to unfold. The cryptocurrency crash explained why my parents were facing foreclosure, but it did not fully explain the urgent, desperate nature of the $400,000 wire transfer. Thomas had told me the funds were marked for a direct escrow deposit to a title company, supposedly for Madison and Jamal to purchase their dream house in the northern suburbs. But liars always weave a thread of truth into their fabrications to make them believable. I needed to verify the destination of that money. I pulled up the exact wire instructions Thomas had securely forwarded to my encrypted email. I copied the routing number and the name of the receiving title company. I pasted the information into a specialized corporate registry database designed to track shell corporations and illicit financial movements. It took less than 10 seconds for the system to flag the entity. A bright red warning banner flashed across my screen. The receiving account did not belong to a legitimate real estate escrow service. It was a phantom liability company. It was a known shell corporation registered to a holding group with a long documented history of representing illicit shadow lenders. Loan sharks. The kind of violent underground syndicate that operates entirely outside the boundaries of the law. The kind of people who do not send polite collection letters or report missed payments to credit bureaus. They are the kind of people who break bones, destroy property, and collect their debts through pure terror. I sat back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp exhale. The entire mega mansion story was a complete and utter fabrication. Madison and Jamal were never buying a house in a gated community. They were never planning to move to the affluent suburbs. The $400,000 was not a down payment. It was a ransom. When Jamal lost my parents' entire net worth in his catastrophic cryptocurrency gamble 2 years ago, he did not just stop there. A degenerate, arrogant gambler never walks away from the table. He doubled down. He realized he could not qualify for legitimate bank loans because his credit was a toxic wasteland. So he went directly to the underground market. He borrowed dirty money from violent people to try and win back his massive losses. And he lost that money too. Now the syndicate was calling in his debt. They wanted their initial capital, they wanted their exorbitant street interest, and they wanted it immediately. If Jamal did not deliver $400,000 by the end of the week, his life was completely forfeit. I sat frozen as the horrifying reality of my parents' involvement crystallized in my mind. Richard and Patricia were not just clueless, desperate boomers being manipulated by a slick son-in-law. They knew everything. They knew exactly how much danger Jamal was in. I could vividly picture the scene. Madison must have run to my parents' house, sobbing hysterically, screaming that her husband was going to be killed or maimed by ruthless criminals. She played the ultimate victim, weaponizing her pregnancy, wailing that her unborn child was going to be left fatherless. And my parents, in their infinite, twisted, and sickening devotion to their golden child, sat down at their kitchen table and consciously decided to sacrifice me to save him. They knew I would never willingly hand over $500,000 to pay off a violent criminal syndicate for a man I despised. So they decided to steal it from me. They orchestrated a federal felony to siphon the equity from my paid-off penthouse. They were perfectly willing to strap me with a massive, fraudulent mortgage. They fully expected me to wake up one day, discover a $400,000 debt attached to my sanctuary, and simply bear the burden out of family loyalty. If I could not pay that massive monthly mortgage, the bank would foreclose on my penthouse. I would lose my home. I would lose my flawless credit rating. I would lose my high-level security clearance in the financial sector, which meant I would be immediately terminated from my position as a director of risk management. I would lose my entire career and everything I had spent my entire adult life building. My parents knew all of this. They mapped out the absolute destruction of my life, weighed it against Jamal's underground gambling debts, and decided I was an acceptable casualty. A wave of revulsion so intense it made me physically nauseous washed over my entire body. This was no longer just about toxic favoritism. This was no longer about them being financially entitled or socially manipulative. This was pure, unadulterated evil. They looked at me, their own flesh and blood, their eldest daughter, and saw nothing but a human shield for Madison's criminal husband. They would rather see me financially ruined, stripped of my home, and thrown out of my career than watch their precious son-in-law face the violent consequences of his own actions. They would rather destroy me completely than let their golden daughter experience a single moment of discomfort or public shame. My hands stopped shaking. The lingering sting of their hateful words from the backyard barbecue completely vanished. I did not feel a single ounce of familial obligation or daughterly guilt anymore. The biological tie between us severed cleanly and permanently, leaving behind nothing but a chilling clinical resolve. They had tried to feed me to the wolves to save a parasite. I closed the investigation tabs on my dual monitors one by one. I had the complete picture now. I knew the exact anatomy of their desperation. They were trapped in a terrifying corner, completely surrounded by federal fraud charges on one side and violent loan sharks on the other. The fake housewarming party was just a frantic theatrical distraction to keep up appearances while they waited for my stolen money to clear. And I held the only key to their cage. I held the power to either release the funds and save Jamal from the syndicate, or keep the money locked in a federal freeze and watch his world burn. The level of absolute disgust I felt for them eradicated any hesitation I might have harbored. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of survival using my assets as the chips. They were about to learn exactly why I am the person corporations hire to annihilate threats. I immediately dialed Valerie. I did not care that it was well past standard business hours. When you have the full backing of a corporate legal powerhouse, time is entirely irrelevant. Valerie answered on the second ring. I briefed her on the horrifying discovery regarding the shell corporation, the loan sharks, and the catastrophic cryptocurrency debt. I explained that my parents were not just covering up a bad real estate deal for my sister, they were actively participating in a desperate scheme to pay off a violent underground syndicate. Valerie was completely silent for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice possessed a terrifying razor-sharp edge. She told me this escalated the situation from a messy domestic dispute to a highly organized criminal conspiracy. But to completely annihilate them, she said we needed more than just a frozen wire transfer and a few public records. We needed an explicit, undeniable confession. We needed Jamal to admit exactly how he manipulated the system on the record, with zero room for plausible deniability. Valerie arranged for a private investigator associated with our corporate firm to meet me at my penthouse early the next morning. He equipped me with a state-of-the-art micro recorder. It was completely undetectable, seamlessly integrated into the lapel of my tailored navy blazer. I was officially wired. The next step required me to swallow my pride and play a role I absolutely despised. I had to play the victim. I drafted a carefully worded text message to Jamal and my parents. I stripped all the confidence and authority from my usual tone. I typed that their email to my executive board had terrified me. I claimed that human resources was threatening to terminate my position, and I simply could not afford to lose my career over a family dispute. I asked them to meet me at a quiet upscale coffee shop downtown to discuss the terms of me releasing the federal hold on the $400,000. The response was almost instantaneous. They eagerly agreed to meet at 10 in the morning. They were completely high on the delusion that their corporate sabotage had successfully broken my spirit. They thought they had backed me into a corner and forced my surrender. I walked into the coffee shop playing the role of a desperate, panicked corporate drone. The cafe was dimly lit and relatively empty, providing the perfect acoustic environment for the hidden microphone. Richard, Patricia, and Jamal were already sitting at a secluded corner booth. Madison had stayed home, likely instructed to play the delicate, stressed pregnant wife out of harm's way. The transformation in Jamal was truly a sight to behold. He was back in his custom Italian suit, his posture completely shifted from the sweating, cornered animal I had confronted by the pool pump. He was practically vibrating with smug superiority. He had a fresh haircut, a gold watch gleaming on his wrist, and a relaxed, arrogant smile spread across his face. My parents looked deeply relieved, their angry scowls from yesterday replaced by patronizing, triumphant expressions. They genuinely believed I was walking into that cafe to hand over the keys to my financial kingdom just to save my job. I sat down across from them, keeping my hands trembling slightly against the marble table to sell the performance. I looked at Jamal with wide, fearful eyes and asked him how we were going to fix this nightmare. I told him I was willing to drop the fraud alert, but I needed absolute assurance that the federal authorities would not come after me for submitting contradictory reports. I played directly to his massive, fragile ego. I asked him how he managed to bypass the bank's automated security systems, so easily, acting as if I was terrified of the paper trail and needed a professional to comfort me. Jamal leaned across the small table. He smirked casually, stirring his expensive espresso with a silver spoon. He told me to take a deep breath and relax. He said he had been managing complex financial structures for years, and that the bank's security protocols were an absolute joke to an insider like him. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, completely unaware that he was speaking directly into a high-definition recording device. See, Chloe, Jamal bragged, his chest puffing out beneath his tailored jacket. I hold the banking loopholes in the palm of my hand. You think your little risk management software is foolproof, but it is entirely blind if you know exactly where to apply the pressure. I know exactly which documents automated systems skip and which ones require manual review. I know how to structure a closing packet so the underwriters never even look twice at an expired identification card. I pressed him further, maintaining my facade of total panic. I whispered that a $400,000 cash out on a stolen identity was a massive red flag, and I was terrified the fraud department would dig deeper even if I withdrew my complaint. Jamal scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He laughed softly and shook his head. Your file is just a small fraction of what I handle, Jamal stated confidently. Do you honestly think this was my first time bypassing the system? I have pulled off dozens of cases exactly like this smoothly. Nobody ever looks closely at the notary stamp when the primary borrower has pristine credit and high equity. You are not special, Chloe. You are just another transaction in my pipeline. I know how to clean up the digital footprint. You just make the call to unfreeze the funds, and I will make the paperwork entirely disappear. The hidden recorder captured every single damning syllable. He had just confessed to operating a massive systemic mortgage fraud ring. He admitted that my forged refinance was not an isolated incident born out of sudden family desperation, but part of a serial ongoing criminal enterprise. He had likely been stealing equity from countless other victims to feed his underground gambling debts. I glanced at my parents. Richard and Patricia sat there sipping their coffee, nodding along as if their son-in-law was a brilliant financial strategist instead of a serial felon admitting to a string of federal crimes. They looked proud of him. They were perfectly comfortable sitting at a table with a man who systematically robbed innocent people as long as it kept their precious Madison living in luxury. I let out a long, shaky breath, pretending to be utterly relieved by his arrogant assurances. I told them I would go back to my office and initiate the release of the funds. Jamal smiled, adjusted his silk tie, and told me I was finally making a smart family decision. I stood up, walked out of the coffee shop, and immediately sent the pristine audio file directly to Valerie. The mouse had just handed the cat a loaded shotgun. I bypassed my corporate office entirely and drove my car straight back to the private wealth management branch. I walked into Thomas's office, locked the heavy glass door securely behind me, and placed my phone directly on his desk. I pressed play. Thomas sat in absolute silence as Jamal's arrogant voice filled the quiet room. He listened to my brother-in-law bragging about exploiting the banking system, manipulating underwriting software, and processing dozens of fraudulent applications. When the recording finally ended, Thomas looked physically ill. The color had completely drained from his face. He stared at the phone as if it were a live explosive. I told Thomas this was no longer just an isolated incident of familial identity theft. Jamal was operating a systemic vulnerability inside the banking infrastructure. I needed Thomas to run a comprehensive system audit using Jamal's specific notary license number and his National Mortgage Licensing System identifier. Thomas did not hesitate. He understood the catastrophic liability his bank was facing. He opened the master archival database and inputted Jamal's credentials. He set the search parameters to span the last 36 months. We watched the loading bar crawl across the screen. I expected to see maybe 4 or 5 suspicious files. Instead, the system returned a staggering list of 62 closed refinance transactions. 62 separate files where Jamal Washington served as either the primary loan originator or the certifying notary public. I pulled my chair closer to the high-resolution monitor. I told Thomas to filter the results by the age of the primary borrower. The screen refreshed instantly. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach as the demographic data aligned into a terrifying, undeniable pattern. Every single borrower on that list was over the age of 70. I clicked on the first file. The homeowner was an 82-year-old widow. The property was completely paid off decades ago. The transaction was a cash-out refinance for $300,000 securely notarized by Jamal. I clicked on the second file. A 78-year-old retired military veteran. Another paid-off property. Another massive equity extraction signed and sealed by my brother-in-law. The anatomy of Jamal's criminal empire was suddenly glaringly obvious. He was not targeting young tech-savvy professionals who monitored their credit reports daily. He was specifically preying on the elderly. He hunted vulnerable senior citizens who had spent their entire lives paying off their mortgages, people who did not check online banking portals or understand complex digital loan disclosures. He was forging their signatures, stamping the documents with his official state seal, and siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars of pure equity directly out of their homes. Because the new loans were automatically paid out of the newly generated mortgage balance for the first few months, the elderly victims had absolutely no idea their homes were being leveraged. They would only find out when the escrow reserve ran dry and the default notices started arriving in their physical mailboxes. By then, the money would be long gone, and the bank would be preparing to foreclose on seniors who thought they owned their homes free and clear. I told Thomas to track the disbursement routing numbers for the cash-out portions of those 62 loans. We cross-referenced the destinations. The money was not going into the senior citizens' checking accounts. The funds were being wired directly to a network of obscure limited liability companies. They were the exact same type of phantom shell corporations tied to the violent underground loan sharks Jamal owed his massive cryptocurrency debts to. Jamal was systematically robbing the elderly to feed his insatiable gambling addiction and keep the underground syndicate off his back. He was buying his custom Italian suits, leasing luxury vehicles, and funding Madison's extravagant lifestyle with money stolen from retired widows. He was building his entire fake persona on the absolute ruin of vulnerable people. This was no longer a simple case of wire fraud. This was a highly organized, predatory mortgage fraud ring operating on a massive scale. By targeting vulnerable senior citizens across state lines and using federal banking channels to launder the stolen equity, Jamal had crossed into the realm of extreme federal crimes. He was triggering elder abuse enhancements and massive institutional fraud penalties. He was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. Thomas looked at me, his hands visibly trembling over his keyboard. He said he had to notify the federal authorities immediately. He said the Bank Compliance Division would have to freeze every single one of these accounts and launch a full internal investigation. I nodded in agreement. The digital footprint was indisputable. Jamal had left a trail of destruction that no lawyer could ever erase. But as I stared at the long list of elderly victims, a horrifying question pierced my analytical mind. How did Jamal find them? A loan officer sitting in a corporate office does not just randomly guess which 80-year-old widow lives alone in a paid-off house. He needed a steady pipeline of targets. He needed a lead generator. He needed someone on the ground, someone who interacted with these specific seniors, someone they trusted enough to hand over their basic personal information without any suspicion. I looked at Thomas and told him to pull up the original contact intake forms for the victims. I needed to see who referred these elderly clients to Jamal's desk in the first place. The system took a moment to load the scanned referral sheets. The names on the referral lines appeared on the screen, and the absolute darkest, most sickening realization of my entire life washed over me. I stared at the digitized intake forms, my breath catching sharply in my throat. The names printed clearly on the referral lines for the first 5 victims were identical. The next 10 were exactly the same. In fact, every single one of the 62 fraudulent loan applications bore the exact same referring signatures. Richard and Patricia, my own parents. A deep, visceral wave of revulsion crashed over me. I had to grip the edge of Thomas's desk to steady myself. My parents were not just passive accomplices who turned a blind eye to save their son-in-law from violent loan sharks. They were the primary lead generators. They were the active predatory mules fueling this entire criminal syndicate. I thought back to my parents' sudden obsession with their local community center and the upscale retirement country club they joined shortly after Jamal lost his massive cryptocurrency bets. They had bragged relentlessly about their busy social calendar. They constantly posted pictures of themselves hosting bingo nights, organizing charity drives, and setting up financial literacy seminars for local seniors. I had assumed it was just another pathetic attempt to maintain their suburban social status. It was not philanthropy. It was a highly calculated hunting ground. I explained the sickening dynamic to Thomas as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. My parents deliberately befriended the most vulnerable, lonely, and cognitively declining seniors in their affluent social circles. They presented themselves as caring, knowledgeable friends. Patricia would sit and listen to their complaints about rising medical costs, complicated healthcare portals, and confusing property taxes. Richard would step in, playing the role of the successful retired executive, and offer a simple, friendly solution. They told these elderly victims they were signing them up for a special state-sponsored medical assistance program or a senior property tax relief fund. I could vividly picture my mother showing up at their houses with freshly baked goods and a stack of dense, confusing paperwork. She would point her perfectly manicured finger exactly where they needed to sign, smiling warmly as they unknowingly surrendered their livelihoods. Because those documents were not applications for medical aid. They were comprehensive power of attorney forms and preliminary cash-out refinance applications. Once my parents secured the physical signatures, they handed the completely weaponized files directly over to Jamal. Jamal used his state-commissioned notary stamp to falsely certify that he had witnessed the signatures in person and verified their identities. Then he pushed the loans through the automated underwriting system, extracted the maximum allowable equity, and wired the hundreds of thousands of dollars straight to the underground syndicate to service his debts. But my parents were not doing this purely out of the goodness of their hearts to protect Madison. Criminals like Richard and Patricia do not operate for free. I told Thomas to run a trace on the small percentage fees attached to the closing costs of those 62 loans. Every mortgage has origination fees. Jamal was likely skimming a percentage right off the top before wiring the bulk to the shadow accounts. Thomas Cross referenced the secondary accounts tied to the loan originations. His eyes widened as the data populated on his screen. Jamal was kicking back a massive finder fee to my parents for every single victim they delivered. My parents were receiving steady, untraceable cash deposits disguised as consulting fees and private gifts. That was how they maintained their expensive country club memberships. That was how they kept up the illusion of wealthy suburban retirees while their own house was secretly in foreclosure. They were literally financing their country club dinners, their imported wines, and Madison's designer baby clothes with the stolen life savings of octogenarians. The sheer level of sociopathy required to execute this operation was beyond anything I had ever encountered in my entire corporate risk management career. I deal with greedy chief executive officers and corrupt hedge fund managers on a daily basis. But this was so much darker. My parents sat in the living rooms of their elderly friends, drank their tea, smiled in their faces, and systematically stripped away the absolute only financial security those people had left in the world. My family was not just toxic. They were not just emotionally abusive or financially entitled. They were a highly organized, ruthless criminal syndicate. They were domestic predators. When Jamal realized my parents had tapped out their network of gullible friends, he aimed them at the ultimate prize: me. They ran out of elderly victims, so they turned their predatory sights on their own eldest daughter. They used the exact same playbook, stealing my old identification card and leveraging Jamal's notary access, expecting me to be just another oblivious mark in their assembly line of fraud. I looked at Thomas. He was staring at his monitors, his face completely pale, realizing his banking institution had been the unwitting vehicle for a massive multi-state elder abuse ring. I told him to print every single intake form, every referral signature, and every closing disclosure tied to those 62 files. I needed the absolute mountain of paper. I gathered the documents as they slid out of the high-speed printer. The stack was incredibly thick. It felt like holding the physical weight of 62 ruined lives. I shoved the files into my heavy leather briefcase, forcing the metal clasps to lock over the overflowing evidence. I told Thomas to lock down the entire digital archive. I instructed him to alert his internal fraud team to prepare for immediate federal subpoenas. I was taking this massive dossier straight to Valerie. This had escalated far beyond an angry daughter confronting her greedy parents over a stolen inheritance. This was a multi-million-dollar federal racketeering and elder abuse case. I grabbed the handle of my briefcase, my knuckles white with pure, unadulterated fury. I was about to drop a legal and federal nuclear bomb on the people who shared my DNA. I drove straight from the bank back to my corporate headquarters. I bypassed my assistant and walked directly into Valerie's corner office, dropping the bulging leather briefcase onto her pristine glass desk. The heavy thud made her look up from her legal briefs. I told her the situation had just escalated from a localized family dispute to a multi-state federal racketeering enterprise. Valerie cleared her schedule for the rest of the day. We spent the next 3 hours laying out the 62 forged loan applications, the falsified notary stamps, the trail of kickback payments disguised as consulting fees, and the horrifying intake forms bearing my parents' signatures. Then I played the high-definition audio recording of Jamal sitting in the coffee shop, arrogantly bragging about exploiting banking vulnerabilities and orchestrating dozens of identical fraudulent transactions. Valerie did not say a word for several minutes. She simply stared at the mountain of physical evidence spread across her desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with a chilling professional awe. She said, "This is not a civil lawsuit, Chloe. This is a massive federal takedown." Valerie picked up her secure phone and dialed a direct line to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She bypassed the standard intake protocols and spoke directly to a senior supervisor she knew from her days as a federal prosecutor. She told him she had a cooperating witness sitting in her office with a fully documented, completely indisputable elder abuse and wire fraud syndicate, complete with a recorded confession from the primary orchestrator. Less than an hour later, 2 federal agents in dark suits walked into our corporate boardroom. They introduced themselves as Special Agent Harrison and Special Agent Davis. They were specialists in white-collar crime and organized racketeering. They unpacked their briefcases and began reviewing the evidence I had meticulously gathered from Thomas. As Agent Harrison listened to the crystal-clear audio recording of Jamal detailing his exact methods for bypassing automated underwriting software, he shook his head in absolute disbelief. He looked at me and said, "Cases like this usually take us 2 years to build from the ground up. You have handed us the entire criminal organization, the money trail, the physical forgeries, and a taped confession wrapped in a neat bow." But there was a catch. Agent Davis placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. His expression was incredibly serious. He explained that taking down an operation of this magnitude requires absolute total coordination. They could not just drive over to my parents' house and arrest Jamal right now. Jamal was tied to a violent underground syndicate. If he caught even a slight hint that federal authorities were investigating him, he would immediately panic. He would wire any remaining stolen funds to untraceable offshore crypto accounts. He would destroy his laptop, shred his physical ledgers, and likely flee the jurisdiction before they could secure arrest warrants for the entire network, including my parents and the shadow brokers he was funneling money to. Agent Harrison gave me a direct, uncompromising order. He told me the Bureau needed exactly 72 hours to secure the necessary federal indictments, freeze the offshore holding accounts, and position tactical arrest teams across multiple locations. For the next 3 days, I had to maintain absolute radio silence regarding the investigation. I had to play the most dangerous game of psychological warfare of my entire life. The agents instructed me to actively deceive my family. I had to convince Jamal, Madison, Richard, and Patricia that my fake corporate panic attack in the coffee shop was completely genuine. I needed to make them believe that I had surrendered completely. I had to pretend that I was actively working with my bank to navigate the complex administrative red tape required to lift the federal fraud freeze. Agent Davis told me to send them highly specific, reassuring text messages. I needed to complain about bank bureaucracy and slow compliance officers. I had to feed them just enough hope to keep them docile and completely unaware of the massive federal dragnet closing in around them. I had to keep Jamal believing that his $400,000 ransom payment was just days away from clearing. It was the ultimate test of my discipline as a risk manager. I had to smile into the dark and text the people who tried to destroy my life, pretending I was still their obedient, terrified victim. I had to swallow my rage and feed their monumental egos. I pulled out my personal phone right there in the boardroom. Agent Davis watched closely as I composed the first message to Jamal. I made sure to use a tone of stressed corporate urgency. I typed that my human resources department was breathing down my neck and that I had just spent 2 hours screaming at the bank compliance officers. I told him the bank required a mandatory holding period to manually reverse the fraud alert, but the funds were guaranteed to be released by Friday evening. I added a pathetic, desperate plea begging him to ensure Madison did not stress herself out over the delay. I hit send. Less than a minute later, Jamal replied. His text was dripping with that familiar, sickening arrogance. He told me to keep pushing the bank and reminded me that he had closing deadlines to meet for the new house. He actually ended the text by telling me I was finally being a good sister. I showed the response to the federal agents. They nodded in approval. The hook was set. Jamal was completely blinded by his own greed and his desperate need to pay off his loan sharks. He had no idea he was texting a woman who had just handed his entire life over to the federal government. I looked at the two agents sitting across from me. I thought about the 82-year-old widow who was going to lose her home because my mother smiled in her face and handed her a fraudulent power of attorney document. I thought about the sheer unadulterated entitlement of my sister demanding my life savings to fund her fake suburban lifestyle. I told Agent Harrison that he would have his 72 hours of absolute silence. I promised him my family would not suspect a single thing. I would play the role of the defeated, compliant daughter so perfectly they would be planning their next luxury vacation right up until the exact second the tactical teams kicked their front doors off the hinges. Valerie smiled her predatory smile. The agents packed up the mountain of evidence, securing it in heavy locked cases. They gave me a secure burner phone to contact them if Jamal made any erratic moves. As they walked out of the boardroom, the countdown officially started. I had 3 days to string my family along, 3 days to let them revel in their false victory, 3 days before their entire world violently collapsed. Friday evening arrived, marking the end of the 72-hour countdown. My secure burner phone received a brief text message from Agent Harrison, confirming that all federal tactical units were moving into their designated positions. At the exact same moment, my personal phone vibrated with a digital invitation. It was a massive, ostentatious electronic flyer for Madison and Jamal's official housewarming party. I stared at the bright screen in absolute disbelief. The $400,000 was still firmly locked in federal purgatory. They had not closed on any property, but Jamal's fragile, toxic ego simply could not handle delaying his victory lap. He needed to prove to his arrogant colleagues and his violent loan shark handlers that he was suddenly flush with cash. He had completely maxed out a series of high-interest credit cards to secure a short-term luxury rental of a sprawling estate in the northern suburbs. He was throwing a lavish catered party in a house he did not even own, banking entirely on the delusion that my stolen equity would magically clear by Monday morning to cover his tracks. I pulled up to the rented mega mansion precisely an hour after the party started. The circular driveway was packed with high-end vehicles, and Jamal had actually hired a private valet service to complete his illusion of wealth. I handed my keys to the attendant and walked up the sweeping stone steps. The massive double doors were wide open, spilling bright, warm light and loud, obnoxious music out onto the manicured lawn. I was not dressed for a casual family gathering. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored black blazer, crimson heels, and my hair was perfectly styled. I did not walk up those stone steps like a defeated, humiliated daughter begging for forgiveness. I walked up like an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. Before I could even cross the threshold, Madison stepped directly into the center of the doorway, physically blocking my path. She was holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider, wearing a ridiculously expensive designer maternity gown that trailed on the polished marble floor. Her face twisted into a deeply condescending, triumphant smirk, She looked me up and down, practically vibrating with unearned superiority. She tilted her head and projected her voice so the guests mingling near the entrance could hear her. She asked if I was here to finally drop to my knees and apologize to her husband. She demanded to know if the money was completely unlocked and ready for her to spend. She told me I had embarrassed this family more than enough with my selfish corporate temper tantrums, and it was about time I showed some proper respect to the people who actually mattered. I did not react to her venom. I did not shrink back or apologize for my existence. I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact and offered her a smile so dangerously cold it could have frozen the cider right inside her glass. I told her that she did not need to worry about a single thing tonight. I told her the bank had fully processed all the final release forms exactly as I promised they would. It was a perfect technical truth. The federal authorities had indeed processed the final release forms, specifically the ones authorizing their synchronized arrest warrants. I told Madison the transaction was completely out of my hands now, and the authorities were handling the final delivery of what they owed her. Madison beamed, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning of my words. She flipped her hair over her shoulder and stepped aside, smugly waving me into her rented kingdom. I stepped into the grand foyer. The scene playing out in front of me was a masterpiece of pathetic criminal delusion. Jamal was holding court in the center of the massive living room. He was surrounded by his sleazy real estate colleagues and a few sharp-looking, intimidating men I immediately identified as his underground associates, checking up on their investment. Jamal was laughing loudly, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, loudly bragging about his brilliant negotiation skills and his new suburban real estate portfolio. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire world. I scanned the crowded room and found my parents. Richard and Patricia were standing near the extravagant catered buffet station, clinking glasses with an elderly couple I recognized from their upscale retirement community. Even now, standing in a fake house funded by maxed-out credit cards and stolen equity, they were still actively hunting. They were still playing the wealthy, benevolent retirees, probably buttering up those poor seniors for the next round of fraudulent power of attorney signatures. The sheer terrifying sociopathy of my parents, functioning seamlessly in a crowded room, made my jaw clench tight. I walked slowly through the crowd. Every step I took was carefully measured. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, but I did not drink it. I simply held it as a prop while I navigated the sea of fake friends, dangerous criminals, and ignorant relatives. Jamal caught my eye from across the room. He paused. His conversation gave me a highly patronizing wink and raised his scotch glass in my direction, silently toasting my total submission. He genuinely thought he had broken the mighty director of risk management. He thought he had successfully weaponized my career and my family against me to fund his miserable, fraudulent life. I offered him a slight knowing nod in return. I let him drink his expensive scotch. I let Madison parade around the room in her designer maternity gown, accepting compliments on a house she was renting by the hour. I let my parents bask in the glow of their imaginary wealth and their predatory social climbing. They were standing at the absolute pinnacle of their massive, fragile mountain of lies. And I was the only person in the room who knew the entire mountain was rigged with federal explosives. I moved toward the center of the room, weaving through the guests, waiting for the perfect moment to bring their entire fake empire crashing down to the floor. I walked with absolute purpose toward the back of the massive living room, where Jamal had set up a professional audio station. A young DJ was busy mixing upbeat tracks, completely unaware of the absolute devastation about to unfold. I reached into my blazer, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it directly on his turntable. I looked him in the eye and told him to kill the music and hand me the microphone. He took one look at my face, snatched the bill, faded the music to absolute silence, and stepped away. The sudden jarring quiet swept through the extravagant room like a shockwave. The laughter died instantly. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. Dozens of faces turned toward the DJ booth expecting a toast or a grand announcement from the family. Madison smiled, adjusting her designer maternity gown, clearly expecting me to deliver a public apology, and announced that I was finally handing over my wealth to her husband. Jamal puffed out his chest, waiting for his coronation. I gripped the microphone. I did not smile. I looked across the sea of expectant faces and let my voice ring out, amplified by the high-end speaker system. I said, "Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this spectacular estate. It truly is a stunning piece of real estate. But before we raise another glass to the happy couple, I think it is vitally important that we clarify exactly what we are celebrating tonight. We are not celebrating a closing. We are not celebrating a new mortgage. I want to welcome every single one of you to the house my brother-in-law rented by the hour, using a stack of maxed-out high-interest credit cards that are scheduled to be permanently declined by tomorrow morning." A collective gasp echoed through the grand foyer. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. Madison froze, the smug, triumphant smile physically dropping from her face as if she had been slapped. Jamal turned the color of ash. The arrogant, wealthy persona he had spent the entire evening projecting shattered into a million pieces in front of his sleazy industry colleagues and his dangerous underground associates. I looked directly at the sharp-suited loan sharks standing near the bar. I saw their eyes narrow as they instantly realized the man they were guarding was completely, hopelessly broke. My father could not handle the public exposure. The meticulously crafted illusion of his wealthy, successful family was burning to the ground in front of his country club friends. Richard let out a guttural roar of absolute rage. He dropped his drink, shoved his way through the crowd of horrified guests, and charged directly at me. His face was purple with fury, and he raised his heavy hand, fully intending to strike me across the face in front of everyone. I did not flinch. I did not step back. With my free hand, I reached into my blazer and pulled out the folded, officially stamped document I had printed from the county database. Just as he lunged into my personal space, I whipped the paper through the air and slapped it directly against his chest. I stared into his furious, bloodshot eyes and spoke right into the microphone so the entire room could hear every single syllable. I asked him, "Which hand are you going to hit me with, Dad? Are you going to use the hand you are raising right now, or are you going to use the hand that signed the bank foreclosure notice on your own childhood home this morning?" Richard stopped dead in his tracks. His raised arm trembled and slowly fell to his side. The paper fluttered from his chest and landed on the floor between us. The bold black letters spelling out "Notice of Default and Foreclosure" stared up at him. The elderly couple from the country club, the ones Patricia had been buttering up by the buffet, actually took a physical step away from my parents, their faces twisting in revulsion and shock. The wealthy facade was completely dead. They were exposed as desperate bankrupt frauds. Across the room, total panic set in. Jamal was sweating profusely. Heavy beads of moisture rolled down his face, ruining his expensive collar. He looked at the loan sharks who were now actively moving toward him, their expressions dark and violent. Jamal realized his fake empire was entirely gone. He dropped his crystal Scotch glass. It shattered violently against the marble floor. He turned his back on his pregnant wife, abandoned his in-laws, and began to sprint frantically toward the heavy French doors leading to the back patio. He was trying to sneak out like a coward. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice cut through the rising chaos like a razor blade. I called out to him. I said, "Going somewhere, Jamal? I have a quick legal question for a senior loan officer. How many years in a federal penitentiary do you get for wire fraud, identity theft, and the systematic financial exploitation of senior citizens in this country? Is it 15 years? Or is it closer to 20? The exact second the word 20 left my mouth, the front double doors of the rented mansion were hit with a deafening explosive force. The heavy wood splintered inward as the doors were smashed wide open. The sudden blast of cold night air was instantly followed by a flood of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the massive front windows. Federal agents poured into the foyer like a tidal wave. They were wearing heavy tactical vests, holding their badges high and shouting commands that completely drowned out the screaming guests. "Federal warrant," a deep voice bellowed. Nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them. The party erupted into absolute hysteria. Wealthy socialites shrieked and dropped their expensive drinks, scrambling to press themselves against the walls. The loan sharks immediately raised their hands, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal raid. Jamal made a desperate, pathetic dive for the patio exit. He did not even make it 3 steps. Two massive FBI agents in dark windbreakers intercepted him with terrifying speed. They tackled my brother-in-law right into the center of the extravagant catered buffet. The long table collapsed under their combined weight. Expensive silver platters flipped into the air. Shrimp cocktail imported cheeses and artisanal sauces exploded across Jamal's custom Italian suit. He hit the floor hard, crying out in pain and shock. The agents pinned him face down into the ruined food, twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed through the room. Jamal lay there covered in garbage, sobbing hysterically as they dragged him to his feet. Agent Harrison, the lead investigator I had met in the corporate boardroom, walked calmly through the terrified crowd. He did not look at Jamal. He walked straight up to where my parents were standing, completely frozen in shock. Patricia was trembling violently, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at her ruined son-in-law. Richard looked like he was going to have a heart attack, his eyes wide and vacant. Agent Harrison pulled out a stack of folded warrants. He looked at my parents with absolute professional disgust. He announced in a loud, clear voice, "Richard and Patricia, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the systematic financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. You have the right to remain silent." Another team of agents moved in, surrounding my parents. Patricia let out a piercing, hysterical scream as an agent firmly grasped her wrists and pulled them behind her back. She begged them to stop crying out that she was a respectable woman, that this was all a massive misunderstanding, that I was just a bitter, jealous daughter making up lies. The agent simply ignored her, locking the cold metal cuffs around her wrists. Richard did not fight. He simply lowered his head in utter defeat as the steel clamped down on him. The entire room watched in horrified silence as the two respectable suburban retirees were marched out the front door in handcuffs past the flashing lights of the federal vehicles lined up in the driveway. The illusion was dead. The debt was collected. The absolute devastation was complete. I walked deliberately toward the back of the massive living room where the hired disc jockey had set up his expensive sound system. The heavy bass of a popular hip-hop track was vibrating through the polished marble floors. I did not ask for permission. I did not tap the man on the shoulder. I simply reached over his digital turntable, pulled the main audio fader all the way down to 0, and plucked the wireless microphone right out of his hand. The sudden deafening silence in the room was absolute. Hundreds of loud, arrogant conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. Every single face in the sprawling, overly decorated room turned toward me. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp, high-pitched feedback echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I smiled. It was not a warm or forgiving smile. It was the calculated, lethal smile of a predator that had finally trapped its prey in an inescapable corner. I looked out over the sea of confused faces and locked my eyes directly onto Jamal and Madison. "Welcome, everyone," I announced, my voice perfectly amplified and slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "Welcome to my sister Madison and my brother-in-law Jamal's highly anticipated housewarming party. It is truly a beautiful estate. However, in the spirit of absolute transparency, I feel obligated to make a slight correction to tonight's program. We are not actually celebrating a new home purchase today. We are celebrating a very expensive short-term luxury rental funded entirely by Jamal's rapidly expiring and soon-to-be maxed-out credit cards." The collective gasp that ripped through the room was instantaneous. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. The wealthy real estate brokers exchanged confused, mocking glances. The underground loan sharks standing in the corner narrowed their eyes, their posture shifting from relaxed to highly threatening as they stared at Jamal. Madison's jaw completely unhinged. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked like a terrified ghost trapped inside a designer maternity gown. She stumbled backward, bumping into a high-top table. Jamal lunged forward from the center of the room, waving his hands frantically. His voice cracked with sheer panic as he yelled at me to put the microphone down. He tried to laugh it off, turning to his intimidating associates and loudly claiming I was just a bitter, jealous sister having a drunken mental breakdown. But Richard did not try to laugh it off. My father's toxic, fragile pride was his most prized possession, and I was actively burning it to the ground in front of his elite social circle. He shoved his way ruthlessly through the crowd of stunned guests. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, uncontrollable rage. He marched directly toward the makeshift stage where I stood, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He raised his right hand high into the air, fully intending to strike me across the face in front of 100 witnesses to force me into humiliated submission. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not cower like the frightened teenager he used to bully. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored black blazer and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. As his hand came down, I thrust the paper directly into his chest. He stumbled, his aggressive momentum broken by my absolute lack of fear. I raised the microphone back to my lips, making sure every single person in the room heard my next words. "Which hand are you going to hit me with, Dad?" I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion, cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Are you going to hit me with the same hand that signed the official bank foreclosure notice on our childhood home this very morning, because you are completely bankrupt? Or are you going to hit me with the hand you used to sign away your entire life savings to cover Jamal's catastrophic cryptocurrency debts?" The physical shock of my words hit Richard so hard, he actually staggered backward. The crisp paper fluttered from his chest and landed face up on the marble floor. The bold red letters of the bank's notice of default were clearly visible to the guests standing in the front row. Patricia let out a horrified, strangled cry from across the room. She dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, sending shards of crystal and expensive alcohol splashing across the shoes of her country club friends. But nobody even blinked. They were too busy staring at the spectacular collapse of my family's social empire. I kept my eyes locked on my father, who was now trembling, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. I spoke directly into the microphone again, ensuring the entire room understood the exact depth of their deception. "That is right, everyone." I continued, my tone ringing with corporate authority. "My parents are completely and entirely destitute. The bank officially seized their suburban property at 9 o'clock this morning because they secretly mortgaged their entire existence to bail out their con artist son-in-law. And tonight they invited you all here to drink cheap champagne and pretend they are still part of your wealthy social circles. They threw this fake party while desperately plotting to steal my life savings to cover their criminal tracks." Madison let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She looked frantically at our parents, then turned to look at Jamal. The sheer horror in her eyes proved that she was finally realizing her entire reality was a fabricated lie. The limitless money was gone. The mega mansion was a rental. Her parents were broke, and the man she married was a fraud who had dragged her entire family into an unrecoverable financial abyss. I stood at the disc jockey booth holding the microphone, watching the absolute destruction of their carefully curated social facade. The illusion they had sacrificed me to protect was permanently shattered. They were stripped completely naked in front of the very people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress and manipulate. The wealthy guests began muttering, stepping away from Richard and Patricia, as if their bankruptcy was a contagious disease. Jamal was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the front door, calculating his odds of making a run for it before his underground creditors could intercept him. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he could use my penthouse equity to save his own skin and buy his way out of a death sentence. But I had just locked the doors to his burning house. I lowered the microphone, offering Jamal one final lethal smile. The social execution was complete, but the main event was just pulling up to the driveway. Jamal was practically vibrating with terror. The smug custom suit wearing real estate mogul had completely vanished, replaced by a cornered rat. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. His eyes darted desperately around the massive living room, searching for any possible exit. The underground loan sharks standing near the corner had already figured out the math. Their investment was gone, and Jamal had lured them to a fake celebration to buy himself time. They started moving toward him, their expressions hardening into pure menace. Jamal took a hesitant step backward. He bumped into a waiter, sending a tray of expensive hors d'oeuvres crashing to the floor. He ignored the mess and turned his body toward the heavy glass doors leading to the backyard patio. He thought he could slip away into the dark. He thought he could just vanish into the suburban night and run from the catastrophic failure he had orchestrated. I watched him inching toward the exit. I gripped the wireless microphone tighter and raised it back to my lips. My voice cut through the murmurs of the horrified guests, entirely halting Jamal in his tracks. "Brother-in-law," I announced, projecting my voice so it reverberated off the vaulted ceilings. "I have a quick legal question for you. How many years in prison do you get for federal wire fraud and the systematic financial exploitation of the elderly in the United States? Is it 20 years? Or do they give you consecutive sentences for all 62 senior citizens you robbed blind?" The words hit the room like a localized earthquake. The wealthy retirees my parents had been buttering up near the buffet suddenly gasped, taking horrified steps away from Richard and Patricia. Jamal froze completely. His hand hovered just inches from the brass handle of the patio door. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The absolute despair in his wide eyes confirmed he knew it was over. He realized I had not just stopped his loan. I had found his hidden files. I had found the 62 elderly victims. I did not even have to wait for his answer. The timing was orchestrated to absolute perfection. The very second the words left my mouth, a deafening crash echoed from the front of the estate. The massive custom double doors of the grand foyer were violently breached, swinging open with enough force to crack the pristine drywall. Simultaneously, the heavy glass patio doors right behind Jamal were kicked open from the outside, shattering a pane of glass onto the stone terrace. A swarm of federal agents flooded the rented mega mansion. They poured in through the front entrance, the back patio, and the side kitchen doors. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision. They wore tactical gear and dark blue windbreakers with 3 highly visible, terrifying letters printed in bold yellow across their backs. FBI. Federal agents, nobody move, a booming voice commanded over a bullhorn. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them. Total chaos erupted inside the luxury rental. The elite wealthy guests shrieked in sheer terror, dropping their crystal glasses and scrambling away from the center of the room. The underground loan sharks instantly froze, raising their hands high in the air, recognizing immediately that federal tactical units were not people you run from or negotiate with. Jamal panicked. Blind, irrational terror took over his entire body. He spun around and made a desperate, pathetic dash for the side hallway leading toward the garage. He made it exactly 3 steps. 2 heavily armored agents tackled him with the force of a freight train. They lifted him entirely off his feet and slammed him face first into the lavish catered buffet table. The impact was spectacular. Expensive silver chafing dishes crashed to the floor. Gourmet food ice and cocktail sauce splattered across Jamal's custom Italian suit. He groaned in severe pain as the agents pinned his arms brutally behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. They hauled him upright, his face smeared with food in utter humiliation. He was hyperventilating, crying out that it was a massive mistake, begging someone to listen to him. Across the room, Richard and Patricia were trying to blend into the crowd of terrified guests. My father was physically attempting to hide behind an upscale real estate broker. It was a pathetic, cowardly display. Special Agent Harrison strode confidently into the center of the living room. He held a thick stack of authorized warrants in his hand. He looked around the chaotic scene, his eyes scanning the crowd, until he spotted my parents cowering near the massive stone fireplace. Richard and Patricia Agent Harrison announced, his voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of the federal government. "Step forward, immediately." My mother let out a shrill, hysterical wail. She collapsed onto her knees, sobbing violently, clinging to my father's pant leg. She cried out to her wealthy country club friends, begging them to help her, screaming that this was all a terrible misunderstanding and that she was a good person. Not a single person moved to assist her. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. My father stood frozen, his face completely drained of blood. The arrogant patriarch who had screamed at me in his backyard just 2 days ago, demanding I hand over my life savings to him, was entirely gone. He looked like a frail, broken, pathetic old man who had just realized his entire life was over. 2 agents marched over to them. They grabbed Richard by the arms, forcefully spinning him around and locking handcuffs onto his wrists. Another agent pulled Patricia up from the floor, securing her wrists in front of her as she continued to thrash and sob uncontrollably. Agent Harrison stood directly in front of them and read the charges loud and clear for the entire room to hear. He stated they were being placed under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and the organized financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. He informed them they had the right to remain silent, a right my mother desperately needed to exercise as she continued screaming her pathetic excuses into the void. I watched the entire spectacle unfold from my elevated position at the disc jockey booth. I did not blink. I wanted to burn this exact image into my memory forever. The flashing red and blue lights from dozens of federal vehicles parked outside illuminated the grand foyer, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over the fake housewarming party. The people who had called me cold, who had demanded my life savings to cover their crimes, who had willingly offered me up as a human shield, were now facing the absolute ruin they had designed for me. The illusion of their wealth and superiority was not just broken, it was handcuffed, read its Miranda rights, and paraded out the front door in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. The federal agents Frog marched my parents toward the shattered front entrance. The scene playing out in front of me was absolute cinematic poetry. The same wealthy country club friends who had been drinking their expensive champagne and laughing at their jokes just 10 minutes ago were now holding up their smartphones. Dozens of glowing screens recorded every single second of Richard and Patricia being paraded through the foyer in heavy steel handcuffs. My father kept his head bowed, staring blankly at the polished marble floor, his shoulders completely slumped. He was utterly broken by the crushing, inescapable weight of public humiliation. My mother, however, was still aggressively fighting her reality. She shrieked at the cameras, frantically demanding her friends call their elite lawyers, begging someone to step forward and attest to her stellar character. A federal agent gently but firmly pushed her forward, silencing her hysterical, entitled demands as they marched her out into the cold night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted their terrified faces in a harsh, unforgiving strobe. Their entire social empire, built on decades of toxic lies, fake wealth, and stolen equity, was completely incinerated in front of a live audience. As the heavy front doors closed behind the agents, a gut-wrenching wail echoed through the grand foyer. I looked down from the elevated disc jockey booth. Madison had collapsed entirely. The designer maternity gown she had proudly paraded around in was now tangled around her knees. She looked completely unhinged, her perfect hair plastered to her sweaty face. The golden child was finally waking up to the brutal reality of the real world. Her husband was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Her parents were joining him. Her limitless bank account was a complete mirage. Madison scrambled across the marble floor on her hands and knees. She crawled directly to the base of the stage where I stood. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms tightly around my ankles. Her tears ruined her expensive makeup, leaving dark, messy streaks running down her pale cheeks. "Chloe, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered desperation. You have to save me. You have to tell the federal agents I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I did not know Jamal was stealing from those old people. I swear I did not know Mom and Dad forged your signature on those bank documents. I am just a pregnant woman trying to build a family. You have millions of dollars, Chloe. You have to give me something. How am I supposed to pay for the baby? Where am I supposed to live? You cannot just leave me here with absolutely nothing. Give me the money. You have to give me the money. I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire adult life mocking my ambition and leeching off my parents. I looked at the sister who had happily agreed to saddle me with a massive fraudulent mortgage just so she could play house in the affluent suburbs. She still thought I was a human ATM. She still thought her tears were enough to erase federal crimes and ultimate betrayal. I calmly raised my right foot and physically pried my crimson high heel out of her frantic, grasping hands. I took one deliberate step back, putting a solid distance between my tailored suit and her pathetic desperation. I slowly crouched down so my face was perfectly level with hers. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I remember you absolutely love playing the victim, Madison. I whispered, my voice echoing with icy, calculated detachment. You built your entire identity on being the helpless, fragile princess who constantly needs rescuing. Well, congratulations. Today is your lucky day. The federal court system is going to let you play that exact role for real. I stood back up, adjusting the crisp lapel of my blazer. I told her that claiming ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you are actively spending stolen funds. I told her I was not her personal bank, and I was definitely not her savior. As for where you are going to live, I continued, my voice carrying zero sympathy. You can start by figuring out how you are going to pay the rent for this fake mega mansion. Jamal maxed out his credit cards to secure this venue for the night, and his accounts are currently frozen by the government. I highly doubt the landlord takes apologies as a valid form of payment. Welcome to the real world, little sister. I turned my back on her loud, hysterical sobbing. I did not look at the remaining guests whispering in the corners. I did not look at the shattered patio glass or the ruined catered buffet. I walked straight out the front doors, breathing in the crisp, cool night air. The circular driveway was chaotic with federal vehicles, but my car was parked safely to the side. I handed the valet ticket to a very confused attendant, who quickly retrieved my vehicle. I slid into the driver's seat, started the powerful engine, and drove away from the flashing police lights. I left the toxic, parasitic wasteland of my family completely behind me in the rearview mirror. The drive back to the city was the most peaceful commute of my entire life. The suffocating weight of familial obligation that had anchored me down for 34 years was permanently severed. I had faced the ultimate betrayal, and I had completely annihilated the threat. My career was locked down and secure. The corporate board now viewed me as an absolute titan of risk management. My wealth was completely untouched. I pulled into the private underground garage of my high-rise building. I took the exclusive elevator straight up to the top floor. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into my penthouse. It was completely silent. It was impeccably clean. It was beautifully, undeniably mine. I walked over to the custom glass wine cellar and pulled out a vintage bottle of red wine I had been saving for a special occasion. I poured a generous measure into a heavy crystal glass. I walked out onto the sprawling private balcony. The icy wind whipped through my hair, but I did not feel cold at all. I looked out over the glittering electric skyline of Chicago. The city lights stretched out endlessly into the dark horizon. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich wine. My assets were fiercely protected. My professional trajectory was soaring higher than ever before. The parasites who tried to bleed me dry were locked in federal holding cells, facing the absolute destruction of their own making. I had built an impenetrable fortress, and I was the sole architect of my own survival. Everything was finally over. I stood alone on top of the world, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating air of absolute freedom. the most profound lesson to draw from this ordeal is that biological ties do not automatically guarantee love, loyalty, or basic human respect. Society often pressures us to forgive and accommodate toxic family members simply because we share the same blood. We are taught that family is supposed to be our ultimate safe haven. However, when the people who are supposed to protect you view your success as nothing more than a communal resource to be exploited, that biological bond becomes a dangerous vulnerability. You cannot negotiate with pure entitlement, and you cannot save people who are entirely willing to destroy you to save themselves. When faced with manipulation, emotional blackmail, or outright betrayal, your greatest weapon is your unwavering boundary. Walking away from a toxic family is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your relatives warm, especially when they are the ones holding the matches. This story is a powerful reminder that true security comes from within. It comes from building your own foundation, understanding your true worth, and refusing to let anyone strip you of your hard-earned peace. Financial and emotional independence gives you the strength to stand tall in the face of absolute betrayal and the power to dismantle the illusions of those who try to victimize you. You are the sole architect of your own survival. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, you unlock the door to absolute freedom. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from toxic family members? And if so, how did it change your life? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your power and walking away from toxicity.